Sometimes the things that change our lives arrive quietly, carried by the current when no one is looking for them. The frozen river had become part of Ethan Brooks's morning routine, the same way breathing had become automatic after years of learning to survive difficult seasons without asking too many questions. Winter had settled heavily across northern Minnesota, covering the landscape in layers of white that softened fence posts, buried old trails, and turned the familiar world outside his cabin into something hushed and distant. Snow clung to the branches of towering pines while a pale gray sky stretched endlessly overhead, promising more flurries before nightfall. Ethan pulled the collar of his wool jacket higher against the cold as his boots crunched across the packed snow leading toward the riverbank. Beside him, Ranger moved with steady confidence, his black and tan coat standing out sharply against the untouched snowdrifts. The 6-year-old German Shepherd had followed this route hundreds of times before. They walked the frozen trail after breakfast each morning without hurry, passing weathered birch trees and listening to the muted sounds of winter breathing through the forest. Ethan had always appreciated winter's honesty. It demanded preparation and respect. There was comfort in its predictability. Ice formed. Snow fell. Days shortened. The river slowed beneath its frozen shell. Life became simpler in certain ways. You focused on the next task. Chop firewood. Clear the porch. Brew coffee strong enough to warm cold hands. Make enough breakfast for one. Ranger trotted several steps ahead before suddenly stopping near the edge of the riverbank. Ethan nearly walked into him. "Come on, buddy," he said gently, expecting the familiar flick of the dog's ears before they continued onward. Instead, Ranger remained perfectly still. His amber eyes focused on the frozen river stretching across the landscape like a silver ribbon trapped beneath layers of ice and drifting snow. Ethan waited. Ranger did not move. The German Shepherd's posture shifted subtly. Not fear, not aggression, determination. He stepped closer to the riverbank, nose lifted toward the bitter air moving across the ice. Ethan frowned. Ranger had never been stubborn without reason. During years spent serving as an army medic, Ethan had learned to recognize when instinct demanded attention. People often sensed danger before understanding it. Animals even more so. Yet retirement had taught him another lesson. Most problems belonged to someone else. He had spent too much of his life carrying burdens he could not fix. After returning home from military service, he built routines designed to keep the world manageable. Morning walks, quiet evenings, one coffee mug drying beside the sink, one place set at the kitchen table. Ranger fit naturally within that carefully measured solitude. The dog glanced back toward Ethan before returning his attention to the frozen river. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air as silence settled around them. Somewhere deep within the forest, a crow called once before falling quiet again. Ethan stepped closer to the riverbank and studied the landscape ahead. The ice appeared unbroken beneath fresh powder. Wind swept delicate patterns across the frozen surface. Nothing seemed unusual. "Ranger," Ethan called softly. "It is time to head back." The German Shepherd refused to move. Instead, he sat near the shoreline with unwavering patience, eyes fixed downstream as though waiting for something only he understood. Ethan released a slow breath that formed a cloud before disappearing into the cold Minnesota air. He had trusted Ranger through thunderstorms, lonely nights, and seasons of grief neither of them could fully explain. Standing beside the frozen river beneath a sky the color of steel, Ethan realized he could not remember a single time the dog had insisted upon something without cause. Snow continued falling gently around them, while the river flowed unseen beneath its shell of ice. And for reasons he could not yet name, Ethan found himself sitting beside Ranger on the frozen riverbank, waiting with him for whatever had convinced a faithful dog that leaving was no longer an option. Minutes passed with no explanation arriving to justify Ranger's stubborn refusal to leave the riverbank, yet Ethan Brooks remained seated beside him beneath the steadily falling snow. The cold pressed through the layers of his wool jacket and insulated jeans while the wind drifting across the frozen water carried the familiar scent of pine and distant wood smoke from cabins scattered miles apart. In another season of his life, Ethan would have dismissed the entire situation as coincidence. He would have patted Ranger's side, tightened his grip on the leash, and returned home to finish whatever task waited on his list. Discipline had shaped him long before grief ever had. During his years as an army medic, hesitation often cost precious time. You assessed, decided, and moved forward. After leaving military service, he carried that habit into civilian life, building days that were predictable enough to keep difficult memories from wandering into the quiet spaces between chores. Ranger had become part of that carefully maintained routine. Morning walks before sunrise, fresh water in the kitchen bowl, evening hours spent beside the wood stove while snowstorms rattled the windows. The German Shepherd had never challenged the rhythm they built together. That was precisely why Ethan could not ignore what was happening now. Ranger rose from the snow and paced several steps along the shoreline before stopping once again. His ears stood alert, amber eyes fixed downstream with unwavering concentration. Ethan followed the direction of the dog's gaze, but found nothing except the broad stretch of white extending toward the bend in the river. The current beneath the ice remained hidden, marked only by occasional groans and distant cracks that echoed through winter's stillness. "You are really serious about this, aren't you?" Ethan murmured. Ranger glanced toward him briefly before returning his attention to the river. The expression in the dog's eyes unsettled him in ways he struggled to explain. It was not anxiety. It was certainty. Ethan removed one glove and checked the old wristwatch he still wore out of habit. Nearly 40 minutes had passed since they should have turned back toward the cabin. He imagined the coffee pot sitting empty beside the sink and the stack of split logs waiting to be organized beneath the covered rack outside. The practical part of him insisted this was enough. Yet another part remembered nights overseas when Ranger's predecessors had sensed danger long before human instinct caught up. Ethan had learned to trust the quiet signals others overlooked. Snow continued drifting around them as the gray morning deepened into early afternoon. Then Ranger suddenly stiffened. His body leaned forward, paws pressing into the snow near the shoreline. Ethan stood immediately. "What is it?" he asked, scanning the river once more. At first, he noticed only shifting patches of ice moving sluggishly beneath accumulated powder near the downstream bend. Then something darker emerged between the white edges of the frozen current. It disappeared momentarily before surfacing again, drifting slowly toward the bank where they stood waiting. Ranger let out a low sound deep within his throat and took several careful steps closer without entering the unstable ice. Ethan narrowed his eyes against the falling snow. The object moved unevenly through the frigid water, carried by a current hidden beneath winter's quiet surface. It was too large to be a branch and too deliberate in shape to be debris. The closer it drifted, the heavier the feeling settling within Ethan's chest became. He could not have explained why his pulse quickened or why Ranger refused to look away. The Minnesota wilderness surrounding them remained silent beneath the snowfall as the dark shape continued its slow approach toward the waiting shoreline, carrying with it a story neither man nor dog had expected to find that morning. The dark shape drifted closer with agonizing slowness, carried by currents hidden beneath the frozen surface of the Minnesota River, while snow continued falling in soft, steady patterns around Ethan Brooks and Ranger. The German Shepherd remained motionless at the shoreline except for the subtle rise and fall of his breathing. His amber eyes tracked the object without blinking, every instinct focused upon whatever winter had chosen to deliver to their quiet morning. Ethan stepped carefully along the riverbank, boots sinking into fresh snow as he searched for stable footing away from the thinner ice near the water's edge. Years as an army medic had taught him that urgency rarely benefited from recklessness. Observe first. Understand what you can, then act. The object surfaced once more before catching against a patch of broken ice lodged near the shoreline. Ranger moved forward immediately but stopped just short of the unstable edge, glancing back toward Ethan as though asking permission while refusing to abandon his vigil. Ethan crouched low and extended a fallen birch branch toward the dark mass trapped among the shifting slush. It took several careful attempts before the branch hooked beneath one of the straps and drew the object slowly toward solid ground. The moment it slid free from the icy water, Ethan felt an unexpected heaviness settle in his chest. It was a backpack, not new and brightly colored like something recently misplaced during a winter outing. This one bore the softened wear of years. The navy canvas had faded unevenly beneath water stains and exposure to the elements. One zipper pull hung crookedly against the front pocket, while frayed stitching marked the shoulder straps. Ranger approached slowly, lowering his head to investigate. He sniffed carefully before sitting beside the recovered bag, his posture protective rather than anxious. Ethan removed his gloves and brushed away clinging slush from the fabric. The backpack felt heavier than expected. He hesitated before unfastening the main compartment. Something about opening a stranger's belongings felt deeply personal, as though crossing the threshold into another person's unfinished story. Yet the frozen river had carried it here for a reason neither he nor Ranger understood. Inside, several items had remained remarkably preserved beneath layers of waterproof lining. Ethan carefully removed a knit scarf folded neatly despite its journey through the current. Beneath it rested a small cosmetic pouch, a paperback novel swollen slightly from moisture, and a clear plastic envelope containing photographs. He paused. Ranger leaned closer, watching with quiet attention. Ethan lifted the photographs into the pale winter light filtering through the snowfall. The first image showed a teenage girl with bright eyes and a wide smile, standing beside an older woman near what appeared to be a county fair. Another captured the same girl holding a blue ribbon while laughing at something beyond the frame. Ordinary moments. Birthday candles. Summer sunshine. Family. Ethan swallowed hard. These were not relics of distant history hidden within an antique trunk. They belonged to someone whose life had unfolded through familiar joys and small celebrations. Tucked beneath the photographs lay several folded sheets of paper secured with a faded ribbon and a silver charm bracelet shaped like tiny snowflakes. Ranger lowered himself into the snow beside Ethan and rested against his shoulder while the river murmured unseen beneath its shell of ice. The world around them remained quiet except for the whisper of falling snow and distant crows moving through the pines. Ethan stared at the collection resting within the backpack and realized that somewhere beyond the frozen riverbank, someone might still remember the girl smiling back at him from those photographs. Some discoveries arrived with answers. Others arrived carrying questions heavy enough to alter the course of an ordinary winter morning forever. The snowfall had softened into a fine mist by the time Ethan Brooks carefully repacked the photographs and folded papers into the weathered backpack resting across his knees. Ranger remained pressed against his side, the German shepherd's steady warmth offering an anchor against the chill that had settled deeper than the Minnesota winter itself. Ethan looked once more at the smiling teenage girl captured in the photographs. There had been sunlight in her eyes, the easy confidence of someone whose future still stretched wide before her. A county fair ribbon, birthday candles glowing against a cake, a hand wrapped around the shoulders of an older woman who looked at her with unmistakable pride. The details lingered long after he tucked the pictures safely back into their plastic sleeve. "Who were you?" he asked quietly, though the river offered no reply. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of Ethan's voice before nudging the backpack gently with his nose. Ethan exhaled and reached once more into the main compartment, his fingers brushing against a smaller zippered pocket hidden beneath the lining. The zipper resisted at first before giving way with a soft metallic pull. Inside rested a laminated library card, its edges worn from years of use. Ethan turned it over carefully beneath the pale afternoon light. Lily Dawson. The name settled heavily in the cold air between him and the waiting river. Beneath the photograph on the card, the listed address belonged to the nearby town of Pine Hollow, less than 20 miles from Ethan's cabin. He stared at the image attached to the card and felt his chest tighten. It was the same girl from the photographs, younger by only a year or two, her smile preserved beneath clear plastic that had somehow survived ice and current. The name stirred no immediate recognition, yet something about it felt strangely familiar. Ethan could not decide whether it came from overheard conversations at the local grocery store or fragments of old newspaper headlines glimpsed years earlier while drinking coffee at the diner. Ranger shifted beside him, ears twitching toward the distant tree line before settling again. The dog seemed calmer now, as though discovering the backpack had fulfilled part of whatever silent purpose had kept him rooted to the riverbank that morning. Ethan glanced toward the gray horizon where daylight had already begun surrendering to the early darkness of northern winters. Returning home suddenly felt impossible. He imagined placing the backpack on his kitchen table beside his single coffee mug and pretending it had never arrived. He could split firewood, feed Ranger, watch the evening news, continue moving through the carefully ordered life he had built after leaving military service. Yet Lily Dawson's smile remained vivid in his thoughts. Someone had packed this backpack with ordinary belongings, never expecting them to disappear into silence. Someone had once waited for this girl to return home, carrying these photographs and folded letters. Ranger rested his head across Ethan's boot, his amber eyes meeting Ethan's with quiet certainty. It was the same look that had convinced him to remain beside the frozen river long after reason suggested leaving. Ethan tightened the backpack straps and rose from the snow-covered bank. The wind carried flakes across the ice while distant church bells drifted faintly through the forest from Pine Hollow beyond the trees. "Looks like we are not done yet," he said softly. Ranger stood immediately, tail swaying once before stepping beside him. Together, they turned away from the river and started toward the trail leading back through the pines, carrying with them a faded backpack, a forgotten name, and the growing realization that some stories wait years for someone willing to remember them. By the time Ethan Brooks and Ranger reached the cabin, dusk had settled across northern Minnesota with the quiet confidence of another winter evening. Snow gathered along the porch railing in soft ridges while pale blue shadows stretched across the yard beneath the towering pines surrounding the property. Ethan hung his wool jacket beside the door and placed the weathered backpack carefully on the kitchen table where a single lamp cast a warm circle of light across the worn wood surface. Ranger settled near the wood stove, though the German shepherd's eyes rarely drifted far from the bag that had altered the course of their ordinary morning. Ethan added another log to the fire before filling the kettle and brewing coffee strong enough to cut through the chill lingering in his bones. Habit guided every movement. One mug, one spoon, one chair pulled away from the table. Yet tonight, the familiar routine felt different. The backpack resting beneath the lamplight carried a presence that transformed the quiet cabin into a place waiting for answers. Ethan sat down slowly and removed the folded letters secured with the faded ribbon. The paper showed signs of age but remained legible beneath careful handwriting that leaned slightly to the right. He hesitated before unfolding the first page. The opening line stopped him immediately. "Dear Mom, I know you worry that I spend too much time trying to fix problems that belong to everyone else." Ethan swallowed and continued reading. Lily Dawson wrote about volunteering at the local community center where children from military families gathered after school, while parents navigated deployments, training schedules, and uncertain futures. She described helping younger students with homework, organizing holiday drives, and listening to children who missed mothers and fathers serving far from home. The words carried youthful optimism untouched by cynicism. She believed small acts of kindness mattered. A ride home after basketball practice. A winter coat donated anonymously. Birthday cupcakes for children whose parents could not attend celebrations because duty called elsewhere. Lily wrote that loneliness often arrived quietly and that people deserved reminders they were not facing difficult seasons alone. Ethan folded the first letter carefully before reaching for the next. This one spoke of dreams rather than memories. Lily hoped to study social work after graduation. She wanted to establish a scholarship fund supporting children connected to military service, especially those whose families struggled financially during transitions back to civilian life. She admitted fears about leaving home and wondering whether one person could truly make a difference. Then came a sentence Ethan read twice before lowering the page. "Maybe helping just one person changes more lives than we ever get to witness." Ranger rose from beside the stove and crossed the room until his head rested gently against Ethan's leg. The cabin remained silent except for the crackling fire and the wind brushing snow against the windows. Ethan looked around the room he had occupied for years without inviting much of the world inside. The neatly stacked firewood, the untouched second chair pushed beneath the table, the single place setting beside the sink. During military service, he had learned how to save lives in moments of crisis. Returning home afterward, he mastered something far more difficult. Keeping emotional distance from suffering he could not solve. Yet Lily Dawson's letters challenged the boundaries he had carefully constructed around himself. The final folded page tucked within the ribbon bundle contained not another letter, but a handwritten list of names. Local businesses, teachers, veterans, organizations, community leaders from Pine Hollow. Beside them, Lily had written a simple note beneath the heading Scholarship Ideas. Start where people already care. Ethan stared at the list while Ranger remained quietly beside him. Outside, winter deepened beneath the Minnesota sky. Inside the cabin, the dreams of a girl from faded photographs continued speaking across the years, asking not for pity or sorrow, but for the chance to finish what compassion had once begun. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of weathered steel, and Ethan Brooks found himself standing outside the Pine Hollow Community Library, with Ranger seated patiently beside him in the cab of his aging pickup truck. Snowbanks lined the sidewalks while storefront windows reflected the pale winter light stretching across the small Minnesota town. Pine Hollow looked exactly as small towns often did during January. The diner displayed handwritten specials near its entrance. A hardware store sign swayed gently above the sidewalk. Church steeples rose above rooftops dusted with fresh snow. Ordinary places carrying extraordinary histories hidden beneath familiar routines. Ethan adjusted the scarf around his neck before lifting the weathered backpack from the passenger seat. Ranger stepped down beside him immediately, his black and tan coat bright against the white landscape. Inside the library, warmth and the scent of old books greeted them. A woman with silver hair looked up from behind the circulation desk and smiled at Ranger before her attention shifted toward Ethan. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. He had rehearsed explanations during the drive into town, yet none sounded quite right. Finally, he placed the laminated library card carefully upon the counter. "I think I found something that belonged to someone from Pine Hollow," he said quietly. The librarian adjusted her glasses before lifting the card. Her expression changed almost instantly. The smile faded into stunned recognition. "Lily Dawson," she whispered. Silence settled between them. Ranger remained seated beside Ethan's leg while the woman stared at the photograph attached to the card. After several moments, she looked up again, her eyes carrying memories she had not expected to revisit that morning. "I knew her," she said softly. "Everyone here did." Ethan listened while the librarian explained that Lily Dawson had volunteered throughout Pine Hollow during high school. She organized book drives for military children, helped elderly neighbors shovel walkways after snowstorms, tutored younger students after classes ended. She had a habit of remembering birthdays and delivering handwritten encouragement cards to people facing difficult times. She believed people deserved to know someone noticed when they were struggling, the librarian said. Even small kindnesses mattered to her. Ethan glanced toward Ranger before returning his attention to the woman across the desk. "What happened?" he asked carefully. The librarian folded her hands together. "Lily disappeared more than 12 years ago during a severe winter storm while traveling home from a volunteer event," she replied. "There were searches, community gatherings, prayer vigils. Eventually life moved forward because people did not know what else to do. But some losses never fully leave a town." The words lingered heavily within the quiet library. Ethan thought about the photographs spread across his kitchen table and the letters tied with faded ribbon. Ranger shifted closer, resting briefly against Ethan's leg as though grounding him in the present. Before leaving, the librarian directed Ethan toward a modest white house near the edge of Pine Hollow. "Her mother still lives there," she said. "Margaret Dawson never stopped loving her daughter. I do not think mothers know how to stop." Snowflakes drifted once again as Ethan and Ranger returned to the truck carrying directions folded carefully within his coat pocket. The streets of Pine Hollow appeared unchanged as children hurried home from school and neighbors carried groceries through the cold. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm of another winter day, Ethan sensed something beginning to stir. The faded backpack had carried him beyond curiosity and into responsibility. Somewhere beyond the snow-covered roads, a mother still lived with unanswered questions and memories carefully protected against time. Ranger lifted his head toward the passing landscape as Ethan started the truck. Neither knew what waited at the end of the drive ahead, but both understood they could not turn away now from a story that had finally found its way home. Margaret Dawson's house stood at the end of a quiet street where snow-covered maple trees formed delicate arches above the sidewalk and winter wreaths still decorated a handful of neighboring front doors despite the holidays having passed weeks earlier. Ethan Brooks parked his truck along the curb and remained seated for a moment with both hands resting against the steering wheel. The folded directions from the librarian remained tucked inside his coat pocket while the weathered backpack occupied the passenger seat beside Ranger. Through the front window of the modest white house, A lamp cast a warm glow across lace curtains that had likely witnessed years of changing seasons and familiar routines. Ethan had faced emergencies in combat zones and delivered difficult news to frightened families during his military service, yet standing outside this quiet home unsettled him in ways he had not anticipated. Some moments demanded technical skill. Others required tenderness. Ranger stepped from the truck and waited beside the front gate, his steady presence offering reassurance without words. Together they crossed the narrow walkway brushed clean of fresh snowfall and climbed the porch steps. Before Ethan could second-guess himself, he rang the bell. Footsteps approached slowly from within the house. The woman who opened the door appeared older than the smiling mother captured in Lily's photographs, yet unmistakably the same person. Silver hair framed gentle features, shaped by years of loving deeply and carrying sorrow with grace. Her eyes shifted first toward Ethan before settling upon the backpack resting carefully in his hands. The color drained from her face. One trembling hand rose instinctively toward her mouth. "Where did you find that?" she whispered. Ethan spoke softly, explaining the frozen river, Ranger's refusal to leave the shoreline, and the current that had carried the weathered bag into their lives. Margaret Dawson listened without interrupting, tears gathering silently before slipping down her cheeks. Ranger moved closer and lowered himself near her feet. After a hesitant pause, Margaret reached down to rest her fingers against the German shepherd's head. "Thank you," she murmured, though whether she addressed Ethan, Ranger, or something greater, neither could say. Inside the house, photographs lined the mantel above a crackling fireplace. Lily appeared throughout every chapter of family life, preserved within polished frames. School portraits, holiday gatherings, graduation celebrations. Margaret invited Ethan to sit at the kitchen table, where 2 mugs of tea soon rested between them. She opened the backpack slowly, reverently touching each item as though greeting pieces of her daughter she had not expected to hold again. The scarf, the bracelet, the paperback novel marked with handwritten notes in the margins. When Margaret unfolded Lily's letters, a fragile smile softened her grief. She never stopped dreaming about helping people, Margaret said quietly, especially military families. Her father served in the army before Lily was born. She understood what uncertainty did to children. Ethan listened while Margaret described the scholarship idea Lily had spoken about endlessly during her final year of high school. Lily wanted to create opportunities for children whose families sacrificed stability through service. She believed communities could bridge the gaps left behind by distance, deployments, and financial hardship. Margaret reached into a nearby drawer and removed a thin folder secured with a faded elastic band. Inside rested legal forms, savings account statements, and handwritten plans bearing Lily's familiar handwriting. "I could never bring myself to finish this after she was gone," Margaret admitted. "Maybe I convinced myself the dream belonged only to her." Ranger rested quietly beneath the kitchen table while snow drifted beyond the windows into the dark Minnesota evening. Ethan looked down at the carefully preserved documents before meeting Margaret's tear-filled gaze. The frozen river had returned more than memories. It had delivered unfinished hope into the hands of people finally ready to carry it forward. And for the first time in years, Ethan realized that sometimes healing begins not by forgetting what was lost, but by choosing together what still deserves to live. Winter gradually loosened its grip on Pine Hollow as February surrendered to the earliest hints of spring, and with the changing season came something the small Minnesota town had not experienced in years. Anticipation rooted not in sorrow, but in possibility. Ethan Brooks found himself driving into town more often than he had during the previous decade combined. Ranger occupied the passenger seat with familiar dignity, his amber eyes following the shifting landscape as snowbanks slowly receded from the roadsides and patches of dormant grass emerged beneath melting drifts. What had begun beside a frozen river had evolved into conversations around library tables, church basements, and community centers where people unfolded old memories alongside fresh ideas. Margaret Dawson arrived carrying Lily's folder tucked carefully beneath her arm at every meeting. The librarian volunteered historical records documenting Lily's community involvement. Retired teachers remembered scholarship essays Lily had written as a teenager about supporting children navigating the uncertainty of military family life. Local business owners offered donations. Veterans organizations pledged assistance. One by one, names from Lily's handwritten list transformed from faded ink on paper into living people willing to continue the work she had imagined years earlier. Ethan often remained near the edges of these gatherings, listening more than speaking. He had spent much of civilian life avoiding deep involvement in causes larger than himself. Yet each conversation drew him farther from the protective solitude he had mistaken for peace. Ranger became an unexpected ambassador within every room they entered. Children gravitated toward the German shepherd instinctively, laughing as they took turns brushing his black and tan coat. Elderly veterans rested weathered hands against his head while sharing stories they had not voiced in years. Military spouses spoke openly while Ranger lay quietly nearby, creating a sense of calm that invited honesty without pressure. Margaret once remarked that people trusted dogs because they listened without preparing responses. Ethan suspected she was right. By early March, the Lily Dawson Family Support Scholarship officially reopened through the combined efforts of Pine Hollow's residents. The original savings account Margaret had preserved through years of grief provided a foundation. Additional contributions arrived from neighbors who understood that generosity rarely required abundance, only willingness. The scholarship expanded beyond financial assistance. Volunteers organized tutoring sessions, winter clothing drives, and mentorship opportunities for children whose parents balanced military service with the complicated realities of everyday life. The community center Lily once served reopened its doors several evenings each week, filling with homework help, shared meals, and laughter that echoed through hallways long accustomed to silence. Ethan watched teenagers mentor younger students while parents exchanged encouragement over coffee brewed in oversized silver urns. Ranger wandered gently through the crowd, accepting ear scratches and quiet affection with patient grace. One afternoon, a young boy whose mother had recently returned from deployment knelt beside the German shepherd and whispered, "I think he knew where to find hope." Ethan overheard the comment while stacking donated books nearby. He glanced toward Ranger, who simply rested his head in the child's lap as though such responsibility belonged naturally to him. Outside, winter's final traces dissolved beneath warming sunlight reflecting across Pine Hollow's streets. Inside the community center, Lily Dawson's dreams continued unfolding through ordinary acts of service carried out by ordinary people. Ethan stood near the doorway observing families reconnecting around folding tables covered in crayons, homework assignments, and casserole dishes delivered by neighbors. Years earlier, Lily had written that helping one person might change more lives than anyone could witness. Looking around the crowded room, while Ranger moved quietly among those gathered there, Ethan realized the truth extended even further. Kindness rarely ended where it began. Sometimes it drifted through time like something carried by an unseen current, arriving exactly where it was needed most and asking only that someone choose to pass it on. By the following winter, the river had frozen once again beneath the vast Minnesota sky, covering its hidden currents beneath sheets of silver and white that reflected the muted afternoon light. Ethan Brooks stood along the familiar shoreline with his hands tucked inside the pockets of his wool coat, while Ranger sat faithfully beside him, his black and tan fur stirring gently in the cold breeze drifting through the pines. A year earlier, this place had been nothing more than another stop along their morning walk, part of a carefully controlled life built around routine and emotional distance. Ethan had measured his days in practical tasks and quiet evenings, believing that solitude offered protection from disappointment. Now, as he watched snowflakes descend toward the frozen river, he understood how profoundly a single unexpected moment could redirect the course of an ordinary life. Behind him, Pine Hollow carried on with the rhythms of another winter season. The Lily Dawson Family Support Scholarship had helped its first group of recipients. Children from military families attended tutoring sessions beneath the community center's warm lights. Volunteers organized meals, winter clothing collections, and mentorship programs inspired by the dreams of a young woman whose compassion had refused to disappear beneath years of silence. Margaret Dawson no longer visited her daughter's photographs with only grief in her heart. She spoke about Lily openly now, sharing stories with laughter woven gently between tears. The librarian displayed a small framed picture near the circulation desk honoring Lily's dedication to service. Ranger had become something of a local legend among Pine Hollow's youngest residents, who greeted him enthusiastically whenever Ethan brought him into town. Yet standing beside the river once more, Ethan recognized that the greatest transformation had occurred quietly within himself. He had spent years believing healing meant learning how not to feel too deeply. Military service had taught him resilience, but loss had convinced him that emotional distance equaled strength. Lily's letters, Margaret's courage, and Ranger's unwavering insistence had revealed another truth entirely. Strength was not found in withdrawal. It emerged through connection, through choosing compassion despite uncertainty, through remaining open to the possibility that kindness still mattered in a complicated world. Ranger rose from the snow and moved closer to the shoreline, though this time there was no urgency in his posture. He simply stood there watching the frozen landscape with calm attentiveness before returning to Ethan's side and resting his head against the veteran's gloved hand. Ethan smiled softly and scratched behind the German shepherd's ears. "You knew something I did not," he murmured. Ranger responded with a quiet exhale, content beneath the gray winter sky. They remained together in comfortable silence while distant church bells drifted across the trees from Pine Hollow. The sound carried through the cold afternoon air like a gentle reminder that life continued, marking time, whether people noticed or not. Ethan glanced toward the river one final time before turning back toward the trail leading home. Snow crunched beneath his boots, while Ranger walked beside him with steady confidence. Ahead waited a cabin no longer defined by isolation. There would be community meetings next week, scholarship applications to review, children eager to read stories to a patient German shepherd, and coffee shared across kitchen tables that once seated only one. Behind them, the frozen river preserved its quiet mysteries beneath layers of ice. Ahead of them stretched the ordinary miracle of another day, filled with opportunities to care for one another. Ethan had not gone searching for purpose that winter morning when Ranger refused to leave the shoreline. He had only chosen to pay attention to a faithful companion asking him to stay. Sometimes the world changes through grand gestures that capture headlines and applause. More often, it changes through smaller moments that ask for presence rather than perfection. A dog who refuses to walk away. A backpack carrying unfinished dreams. A town willing to remember. A veteran learning that hope can return when least expected. As the snowfall deepened around them and the fading light painted the river in shades of silver, Ethan understood that miracles rarely arrive looking the way people imagine. Sometimes they drift quietly into view and wait patiently for someone kind enough to carry them home.